Okay, so let me get this straight. And this is, as I understand it, what herd immunity is. Okay, let's go back a little bit. To begin with, let's say that there are these microscopic, let's call them bugs, and none of us can see them, but we know they exist because we can see them under a microscope. And based on that, we know they exist, even though well, when we don't have a microscope available in order to see them, we presume them to still exist because we're empiricists and we only believe in whatever the product of our senses provides for us, even if we can't see them except in the context of a microscope. Okay, that works. Now, sometimes these microscopic organisms, which are believed to exist within us, within me, even though I've never seen them, and I don't have a microscope even to observe them within myself, and I'd have no way of knowing that they were actually within me and not the microscope itself, even if I could, they kill us. Now, I've never experienced death before as a subject. I've only experienced it in others, ostensibly, as an object. And it's really questionable what that is then. Is there still consciousness after death? I've only met a few people who've experienced it subjectively to say yes. And of course, if that were not the case, then there would be no evidence of death whatsoever, except that death is defined as a cessation of consciousness. So we're kind of in a dilemma there. But we presume death to be bad. We presume death to be a problem, and there's no real reason why we believe that, except that we tend not to like it when someone else doesn't act conscious anymore. If that person's sleeping, that's fine, but if that person irreversibly does not return, then that bothers us. Of course, it tends to bother us even more sometimes if that person does return, and we're usually so traumatized that we ignore any evidence of it having happened and say this stuff doesn't ever happen. But really, for the most part, death is something that is either secondary to us or tertiary to us. Secondary in the sense that, well, there are people in our lives which we don't see anymore. And tertiary in the sense that there are people that you hear about as having died. This is obviously getting very, very basic, but let's break down the very fundamental presumptions that are leading to our conclusions today. Now, again, as someone who's followed a number of cults and religious institutions and ways of thinking, and entertained a number of opinions, I've had my share of open-mindedness. So I can understand how the mind is capable of deluding itself and believing something without radical empirical evidence. And by radical, I mean deeply personal. I mean, it can't be controverted because it can't even be explained. There's a certain sense in which most of what we experience is arguably like that, right? We can't exactly describe what the nuances of a given situation are, but to some degree, we can seek to confer with others. There's a religious background also in the scientific community, because it's essentially no different from the church. It's got the same structure of the same power structure, the same dignity accorded by the community, the same kind of hierarchical attribution of power through social status, which is in turn projected onto the natural world which it observes. You know, in more religious times, or I should say more clerical times, the church was presumed to have been granted its authority by God, so the most powerful members of the church were the ones who are ordained. So the world that you were studying, the world of God, was presumed to have lent that authority to the church, and in that sense mirrored it. Well, in the same way, in the scientific community, for one thing, it's believed that the most that the senior members are in a certain sense the most intelligent, maybe the most evolved, though it varies. There's nuance in that. But it's generally presumed that they acquired their authority not arbitrarily, but that the natural world also follows similar hierarchies. In the same way as heaven was believed originally by the Jews to follow a series of hierarchies, and the most holy people would go to the highest levels. So all that's really changed is the shift that Hegel was talking about between the other world and this world. If you're otherworldly, you tend to believe that God intends for you to be in power. If you're this worldly, you tend to believe that this is the way of nature. And in either case, you're content with the power that you have because power is a corrupting passion. Now, what these two institutions have in common, the church and the scientific community, is that they ascribe a truth. And a truth is an interpretation of our sensory and other experience in the context of language. It is, as Heidegger would put it, a comportment of an idea, a set of words used to describe that idea, to convey that idea, which in turn also point to a given being or thing, which is then represented by the idea. And even if your epistemology is slightly different from this, for the most part, a lot of us seem to believe this truth to exist, but not only to exist, but to be interpersonal, intersubjective, not radically subjective. You see, we look around at the world and we recognize it because we've ascribed names to different objects within the world. And in situations that we've shared with people where they described things by the same name, where they basically pointed to the same object and said the same word, we learn to say, well, this is a salt shaker, or whatever it is that you wish to describe it. And that works practically, though it gets interesting when we really become specific about what we describe, because we begin to see how much of the world is actually influenced by the subject and the subjective factor, that is to say, the individuality of the subjective observer, who may very well be living in a world different from everyone else, because it might be possible that every one of us is actually, in many ways, psychologically strange. So, this is an interesting situation to find yourself in as a human being. Just being alive is really, in a way, a trip. But why, then, do we not experience it as being mysterious? And part of this is because of the herd mentality, the herd instinct, as it's called, which is really just a tendency for human beings, if they feel insecure in the wake of a profoundly puzzling world, where certainty may be rare if possible, they seek agreement with one another, which is really, at the root, a kind of collective power structure. This seems to be why people get into politics and things like that. When you're in a group of people, sometimes the tendency is to stay within that group of people and to look out for each other's needs, practically tribally. And these needs become prioritized over the needs of another tribe of people. This is why war arguably originated. And what is happening is a flowing of power. Every member of the group feels empowered insofar as that person is revered by the other members of the group. And through this arrangement, we're able to have small societies. Though it's harder in this context to look at the bigger picture of larger societies and people outside of your group, outside of your immediate age group or immediate family, and your immediate interests as well. Because in many ways, your ego is then defined by the members of that group sociologically. There's also a tendency sociologically to exclude people from your group if they've behaved in a way that does not reflect what's been defined as healthy self-interest in the group. And, of course, to exclude from the group people who don't seem to fit in, or people who seem to fit in with another group which seems to have different interests. And during this time, the way that you maintain communication in this group is through agreements with the members of this group on things which are fundamentally simplistic and vague. This is what this story goes back to the Greek times, ancient Greek times, with Socrates. Socrates discovered that a lot of men, predominantly male men, would develop an ideal such as honor and talk a lot about it. But when you actually ask them individually what it meant to them, they couldn't really give you a definite answer, and their answers would vary from one another, even within the group, where before they'd agreed to know what it was, or know what oppression is, or privilege, or race, or sexism, or monetary value, or the greatest good, or health, or science. Whatever the case may be, as soon as people were questioned enough, they became insecure. Because to begin with, what they'd agreed to was just a set of symbols, but they forgot that every person who uses the symbols brings a different meaning to it. There was no definite truth to begin with, but we would always project onto the world around us our own individual perceptions of it. And that is a very mysterious phenomenon, psychologically. So let's go back to this notion of viruses. Supposedly, and the superstition says, there are these little tiny bugs within you. They're practically bugs. And they reproduce, and every time they reproduce, they kill the fundamental building blocks of what we are. This idea goes back to Democritus, that we are all basically atomizable to atoms. And in the biological school, these things are considered cells. Now, human beings usually tend to think that the very fact that mathematics and physics and biology all map onto each other perfectly is evidence that there's an underlying truth there, that they're actually exploring, an underlying logos, so to speak, which is considered one of the great banes of Western metaphysical thinking, and therefore physical thinking in the physical sciences, to always seek an underlying universal binding truth, which is believed to have been there before we came by and ascribed it to it. But it's interesting when you study the history of thought, you see how the only reason why the sciences even map onto each other is because they were all basically derived from the same ideas. And because those ideas were so stringently enforced within the scientific community, within that power structure, they never really left, such as the materialistic view of the world, the mechanical view of the world, that Sheldrake and Watts respectively talk about, the notion of a difference between blind matter and intelligence, the notion of self-awareness as something distinct from stupidity, the notion of a stupid libido, all of these things, and the notion of things being atomizable, and reducible to basic building blocks. Though building blocks without necessarily a builder who was constructing these blocks, though originally the only reason we believed that things were reducible to building blocks was because we needed to prove the existence of a builder, which was something that the church influenced us in. All of these things are pervasive throughout our frame of reference culturally. These are philosophical ideas. It's only when we begin to impose those philosophical ideas, not upon so much our experience, but upon each other, that we begin to develop what we call scientific truth. If I'm forced to accept your interpretation of what I experience, then that becomes my truth if I agree to it. But if I offer a different explanation, I'm vilified for lending a different label or a set of labels to the same experience. Now, of course, that changes the experience itself because it may very well become more authentic to me, though at the expense of my participation within the group and at the expense of my participation choice to conform. So, what do we see in immunology? What is it? The basic idea? Basic idea is that you're being taken apart like a building by these enemies, these bugs. And the only reason they're enemies, the only reason we deem them to be bad, the only reason we say, oh, they're not even alive, is because they tend to threaten what we consider our lives. We consider this mortal form, which many of us have decided is the only kind of existence we have, because it's the only kind that we remember experiencing. And incidentally, there are a number of experiences that we have which we forget customarily, which aren't confined to this mortal form, such as dreams. And we always make the mistake, don't we, of saying that these things can be understood if we refer to ourselves or allow ourselves to be referred to as objects. We presume, for instance, that dreams are the product of brain activity. But you see, you notice that when we see ourselves as objects and not as just as subjects, and that we don't make that distinction, it overlooks a lot of the troubling problems. For instance, how is it that if we are all basically in one environment, and in a sense part of one consciousness, which is becoming more and more self-aware of itself as one consciousness all the time, to the point that some people are even suspecting that it will become a singular consciousness, which is really ridiculous. How is it that I am able to perceive things from this frame of reference, and I notice things that other people aren't able to notice, and remember things that other people aren't able to remember, and they're able to do things that I can't even do with my mind? I mean, do I just presume that they can't really do that? Do I fall into solipsism? Or do I acknowledge that this is very strange, that I experience myself as myself? The best metaphor I could think of to describe this mystery is that of, to quote Timothy Speed-Levitch, that self-awareness is realizing that you're a dream character in someone else's dream. And that all of these other people are characters in your dream. This is a phenomenological view which at least seems to account for the way that we experience things. But we for some reason forget that every one of us is basically living in a separate universe of experiences. Because all that you know of the universe is your experience and your intuition, and maybe occasionally something else that is even more mysterious than that. I mean, but that life's mysterious is a matter, really, of common sense when you really begin to think about it. But people don't want to because of the herd instinct. They've developed this notion that we agree about the truth. They've forgotten the individual peculiarities, which seem to suggest that even our attempts to agree about things are, in a sense, illusory and fantastic. Fantastic not in the sense that, oh, this is wonderful, but fantastic in the sense that we fantasize this to be the case. So this is the human predicament as I see it. But how does the average American see it? Well, you know what they say about Americans, they love their science. They love to ascribe words to things and believe the words to hold an absolute authority, so that you can actually shame people and be violent towards people and force them to do things using language, using only elaborate forms of language, and saying that your interpretation of it is the right one, even though, even in your group, if you really had to look at it, you might find that there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of incongruence. But when you're in power, and the people in the group allow you to be in power, you can exercise all of the abuse that you want. Because what is power for if not to be abused, right? So let's go back to our narrative here. The narrative is, and it's as much a social narrative as a scientific one. There's no difference whatsoever. Because it is all for more or less humanly constructed, how we make sense of it, how we impose our sense onto it, and pretend that it was there to begin with. These tiny bugs travel not just from one building block to another, reproducing much like people do, and much like many life forms do, even though we claim them not to be life forms. But they also travel to other people. And they're responsible for you feeling bad every once in a while and feeling sick. Of course, you wouldn't know when you were sick if other people didn't tell you that you were sick. You'd just think that you were exhausted or something strange was happening. And the problem with this also goes into things like mental illness as opposed to physical illness. Sometimes you feel mentally ill. The question is, well, do you treat that as though it were a physical illness? Or do you acknowledge that just by its being mental means that there's nothing physical about it at all? Well, what's the real difference? Well, there is a real difference. The real difference is, in one of these cases, you're a subject. You're an individual with dignity. In the other cases, you're an object. You only exist insofar as other people perceive you a certain way. And it's really a very insecure place to be, because all of them are going to perceive you differently. And it's probably going to be different than how you perceive yourself, or what you perceive them to be perceiving you as. Right? There's a lot of incongruency there. Why not just live your life as an individual and acknowledge that you're the one who decides what reality really is for yourself? And you're not going to force it onto anyone. This is why it's ridiculous to compare people who refuse to be vaccinated to murderers. Murderers entirely force their paradigm of death onto others. And they're not ethical because they're not setting an example through their own actions. If you commit suicide, that's setting an example. If you murder, that's being a hypocrite because you're still alive. But if you refuse vaccination, that might very well be setting an example. It's not an example that necessarily everyone has to follow, but it's a risk that